Psalm chapter 98 and verse 1 is where my heart's at this morning, and I've already shared a few things there with you, and just to be clear, in my life, it's not the first time he's been there for me. It's not the first time he's picked up the pieces. It's not the first time that I got hit blindsided with something I'd never even thought about, and the Lord was there to help the doctors, to help me, and you know my other story of heart attack and dying on the table at Baptist, and not even realizing what was going on until the Lord brought me back or had me in the right place where the doctors could shock me, and they said if I hadn't had that, I wouldn't be here. Well, even more than that, if I hadn't had Jesus and Him in my life, I wouldn't have been breathing on the other side of that. I wouldn't have been walking and talking at all. But those things even pale and more in comparison to what He did for me when I was about 6 years old. Came into my heart, saved my soul, give me a home in heaven, forgave me of my sins, past, present, and future, and made me His child. And that's why He loves me. Or because He loved me, that's why He did that, and the things He's done since then in my life, and I don't know how that I've been, why He's chosen to bless me the way He has, but I'm thankful for it this morning, and because I'm His child, I'm going to claim it. And the devil said this morning or this week, he said, you don't want to stand up there and talk about these things because it's about you. Well, it's not so much about me, it's about what God's done for me. And verse 1 in chapter 98 of Psalm says, "O sing unto the Lord a new song, for He hath done marvelous things. His right hand and His holy arm hath gotten Him the victory." And when the children of Israel had a battle or they had something going on in their lives and the Lord brought the victory, they'd get up and sing about it. I mean, they'd praise the Lord. And when the outside world would look on them, and they feared Him, really they did, because God was on their side. And they'd hear this victory song, I believe, and they wouldn't thinking about, well, Israel's a mighty nation, and they've got a mighty army, but no, they were thinking about the God that they were singing about. That's what I want to do this morning. I want to praise Him. What He's done for me. And no, I'm not nobody great, and I'm not nobody worthy, and I'm not nobody that's famous or somebody that's He found favor in, no. But He gave me the victory. First of all, in Jesus on the cross. And then many, many, many times since then. And so many times I fail Him. But He's God. And He loves me. And He's worthy of my praise. He's worthy of my victory song. I ought to be like the touchdown dance at the end of the closing game. Or the victory points. He's worthy this morning of our praise. He's worthy. And I know there's many, many more that are suffering. Many, many more that are sick. Many that they need our prayers. But even if the news hadn't been Good Friday, He's still God. Even if they went in there and found things that they didn't even know about yet, and that happens a lot, They open somebody up sometimes, and they say, well, we're just going to sew you back up and let you live as long as you're going to live. He's still God in that case too. And His love and His mercy is still great and wonderful. I'm glad He has a plan, don't you? I don't know where I'm headed from here. I don't know what He has for me, but I'm still here. My heart's still beating, and I'm cancer-free right now as far as I know. And I want to praise Him this morning and lift Him up, what He's done for me, what He's done for others, and I want to tell others about Him. He's worthy of our witness. He's worthy of our testimony. He's worthy of all praise. So a victory song this morning, a victory tribute, our lives.
So we've been in Acts last Sunday and talked a little bit about Peter and him preaching, and today we got Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And leading up to the section that we're going to be focusing on, for a little background, Paul in the Corinthians church had a lot of issues with driving out worldliness. There had been a lot of idols, and basically, I mean, it's been said before, and y'all probably know too, but Corinth was a very big place. It was a big city. It had a lot of worldly culture, and they had pagan idols, and a lot of what went on inside those temples was, I mean, it was really bad stuff. It was things that would be very secular, very worldly, very indulging to the flesh. There was a whole lot of that in the background of these folks. And so in the chapters leading up to this, Paul had kind of went around and explained some principles of what they could eat and drink, and he explained some principles about marriage and being chaste, and he ended up explaining a little bit about liberty in chapter 8 leading up to this. And the context is important because Paul lays a foundation and shows that not every Christian has to be exactly the same. Depending on which situation you're in or walk of life you're in, you may need to walk a little differently than somebody else. Not that we disregard God's law, which he's going to cover that, but he says we're under the law to Christ, meaning that through faith we submit ourselves to Christ and his will and his way. And sometimes, though, there's religious traditions or cultural traditions that the Bible doesn't exactly say one way or the other on, and you may have to use a little bit of wisdom and liberty in order to navigate those areas. And Paul was saying that he's just been doing that in an effort to preach the gospel and to gain opportunities, but he was getting a lot of resistance. There were people in this church, in this congregation, that they either didn't want to go along with the program, they were being very worldly, or you had the other side was people who were heckling him and challenging him on his authority as an apostle. And so Paul starts out in chapter 9, and he goes through and explains that he truly is an apostle. He gives some evidences of it, and he actually says in verse 1, he says, "Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord?" And so Paul just lays this out at the beginning to try to get to their consciences and remind them of some things that they could very much see evident right in front of their eyes. That he had actually a good testimony, that he had performed sign gifts, that he had seen the actual Lord, and had a good witness of that. He was even challenged them, saying that they themselves would not be the way they are. They would not be reforming. They would not be coming out of the world if it had not been for him and his ministry. He goes on and says, "If I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you. For the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord. Mine answer to them that do examine me is this." So Paul says that ultimately his the reality and the evidence of his apostleship was based on the fact that his ministry was going outward, that he was actually had power to go and preach and convert men's hearts, something that we know that only the Spirit of God can actually do. And so we see in this ministry of Paul that he was being confirmed that he had power from the Spirit. But then he goes on to explain a little bit, and he says, "Have we not power to eat and to drink?" So here he starts to bring in the fact that the same liberties that he said the believers had, that you could, he didn't say flat out you couldn't eat from a place where the temples were, the idols were, or where meat was sacrificed. He didn't say you wholesale couldn't eat from there. But he laid out a principle saying if you give thanks to God and it's what you're able to get, then eat it. But he also told them don't do things that would cause your brother to stumble. Don't do things that would be an offense to their conscience, especially if you knew it would be. And so he says here, though, have we not power to eat and to drink? He says, have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas? Or I only and Barnabas, have not we power to forbear working? And so the particular issue was revealed right there at the end of that verse. They were challenging Paul on the fact that he was saying that he should reap benefits from his congregations. He was explaining to them here that he has the same liberties as any other Christian would. He has the liberty to be a part of the church. He has the liberty to partake of the benefits of being in a church. He has the liberty to receive assistance when he needs help as a member of a church. He was saying, he said, we have all the same liberties. He said, even though we're apostles, he said, we still have the right to take along a wife if we want to. Peter did. And Paul was just reminding them that even though he was an apostle, it didn't mean that he got held to a place where he didn't have the same Christian liberty. And he goes on to say, who goeth a warfare any time at his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard, and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth a flock, and eateth not the milk thereof? He said, say I these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doeth God take care for oxen? Or saith he it altogether for our sakes, no doubt? This is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and that he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of this hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we reap your carnal things? If others be partakers of this power over you, and are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. And this is the context leading up to the main text verses we're going to focus on, because Paul does something that goes a little bit above and beyond here. He had the right to meat and drink. He had the right to assistance from the churches. He had a right to be compensated for his effort and his working, serving the Lord and preaching and doing his job as an apostle. But rather, Paul said, rather than have the cause of Christ or the gospel of Christ be hindered, he would rather go above and lay off these rights. He would rather suffer. He would rather continue working and preaching. He would rather continue being an ease of burden rather than being a burden, if it meant that he could further the gospel of Christ. And so ultimately in our lesson today, it's titled Jesus Displayed, and it's going to really lay out a good example from the Apostle Paul of a desire and a right heart that we ought to seek in intending to further the gospel of Christ. Even if it means that we have to lay off rights that we have, and maybe we have to suffer things that it's just not right for us to suffer, it'll be worth it for the cause of Christ. He said in verse 13, do ye not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. But I have used none of these things, neither have I written these things, that it should be so done unto me. For it were better for me to die, than that any man should make my glorying void. He says, for though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of. For necessity is laid upon me, yea, woe is unto me, if I preach not the gospel. So Paul then goes on to lay out to us what his real motivation was. See, Peter and Paul both warn us in other parts of the Bible and tell us that one of the ways you can point out a false teacher, one of the ways that you can point out a wolf amongst the sheep, is when their true motivation is profit. When the business of preaching for them is nothing more than a career choice. When the business of preaching is all done so that they can reap the carnal, material benefits of doing that job. He said that's one thing that will point them out real quick. Though Paul does be careful to mention that the law assures it and God backs it, that you ought to, as a congregation, take care of your ministers. If we as a congregation are doing really well, our preacher ought not to be suffering unnecessarily. See, that's where we can take a use of our own liberty, and we can say, I want to give, I want to help, because I don't want to see you suffering. Paul then was doing that back to them and showing them this because the Corinthians were not getting it. They were not realizing it. Paul and the other apostles, they were suffering, and they were suffering greatly. And yet the Corinthians, a lot of times, they were very high-minded and proud because a lot of the issues that were being talked about is they were still concerned with their trivial secular affairs. They were still concerned with how much they could eat or drink, or whenever they came together to eat the Lord's Supper. If you can imagine this being a situation, they would show up in the church, and some would bring a whole bunch of food, and others wouldn't hardly have nothing. And here we're claiming to be Christians in the church, and this one would sit over here and eat and drink so much they'd be a glutton and a drunkard, and one over here starving to death. Paul says this is not what the church ought to look like. This is in no way what the church ought to look like. He says this is not what Jesus would have done. Matter of fact, he draws it straight from the Lord's examples, where when Jesus was faced with 5,000 hungry people, Paul makes mention of that in a place or two, where the Lord, his character was always to meet the needs of those that needed. And Paul was mimicking and showing that he was doing the same thing for these churches because he was more concerned about their souls. That even though they had the opportunity and even though they had the ability, Paul said, I would willingly rather not be a burden to you as long as I can keep preaching to you. As long as I could still do that job, because it was his very meat and his very drink. And, it's an example that the Lord laid down for us in John chapter 4 when he went to Samaria. And he must needs, the Bible said, he had a need to go through there. And when he got there, he preached to that woman because she needed him. And then when she ran off to the town, the disciples tried to beg him to get him to eat because they were hungry and they hadn't eaten in a while. But he told them there, he said, I have meat to eat you know not of. He could have sat down and ate a nice dinner. But what refreshed his spirit and motivated him to go onward was preaching the gospel. He lived off the meat of doing that work. And Paul was mimicking that. He said, for if I do this thing willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. Paul was laying out his conviction about how important the command to preach the gospel was to him. He said, if I do it willingly, God is gracious and merciful, and he will still give reward. And I tell you, it's the same for you. If you willingly serve the Lord, and if you go out with a true heart and a desire to do this work for God, then you'll receive rewards. He'll bless you in the end, not because you deserve it, just because he's good. But Paul says this, he says, even if I don't want to, even if that works against my will, he says, you've got a charge laid on you. You've got a dispensation. You've got a weight, a commission of a responsibility laid on your shoulders to preach the gospel. Our field and our scope may not be as big as what the Apostle Paul had. It may be a smaller scope, but we have a responsibility day after day, whether we want to or not, to preach the gospel. And he said, what is my reward then? Verily that, when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. Paul's heart was that in his work, he would live such a life and leave such an example that when people came behind and looked and saw the effects, the evidence that was left behind of the preaching of the gospel, he wanted more than anything, more than his own reputation, he wanted the gospel of Christ to be glorified. He wanted people to see that when a man comes and preaches the power of God unto salvation, that real change follows. That men are purified, that churches were purified, that souls were saved, that the Lord's name was praised, and that those who remained hardened in sin were fearful of the power and majesty of God. That was his true desire, is that when he got done with it, he didn't make a name for himself, but that men respected the gospel of Christ. He said, for though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more. Here Paul lays out the most Christ-like example I can think of that he gives us of himself. is that he had no, I'm trying to say he had rights that he didn't have to suffer. We've already covered that. But he's saying here that he's free from all men. He doesn't owe a debt to men. He doesn't owe men, honestly, even God doesn't owe us the gospel. And that's what Paul's saying here, basically. I guess that's the best way I can put it is he's saying he doesn't owe this. God doesn't owe it to us, but he has willingly made himself a servant. Just like when Christ came down from heaven, he didn't owe us that. God said that he would come, and God didn't owe us that promise either. But yet, he still did it that he might gain the more. I mean, ultimately, one thing we should never ever forget about our God is that he is righteous, he is holy, his law is unflinching. But his real desire and delight is to show mercy. If he just wanted perfect creatures to do his every bidding every time he spoke, just because he spoke it, you would be an angel. You wouldn't be a human. But when he made men, he gave us a choice. And having made the wrong choice, God then showed his love for you in saving you from the consequences of that. We still live with temporal consequences of it. I myself get so frustrated, and Paul's going to cover it here in the very last verse, talking about keeping your body under subjection. But we have to live in a reality now where we have a flesh that is contrary to our spirit. It's frustrating, but it's something we have to deal with. But I thank God that even though he doesn't owe us that salvation, he willingly made himself a servant. And so we should follow the example of the apostle here, Paul, who's just following the example of Christ in making ourselves servants if we have to. If it comes to that, if it comes to gaining an opportunity to preach the gospel, if you have to make yourself a servant, it's the path we ought to take. He said, "And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some." He was saying here, if I have to go and observe some of the ridiculous religious convictions of the Jews, as long as they're not contrary to the law of God, then I'll do that to be at peace with them, to gain an opportunity to speak the gospel. He was saying, if I have to go to the Gentiles and I don't observe any of the Jewish regulation and tradition because I want to be identified with them, as long as I'm not contrary to the law of God, then I'm going to walk with them and do what I must as a servant here to gain an opportunity to speak to them. He said if one's weak, the way I understand weak here, he's talking about the weak of this world, the downcast, the downtrodden, the poor, the afflicted, the ones without faith. He's saying, the weak ones, if I have to even go down and live on that level in order to get an opportunity to speak the gospel, he said that's what I want to do. More so than just want to and motivation at this point. Paul had already done this a few times. But he had said that he wanted to be all things to all men, that he might save some. That was his great desire. And I love the motivation because he's not going at it with maybe a positive outlook. If you look at the words there, he says, all men, that I might save some. Paul, by experience and living in this world, and I think it's hard for us to grasp it because there's been many years of Christianity and its influences on this world that have changed this world drastically. We live in I believe, even though there is a lot of corruption that you see, the average governmental authority today does still respect Christianity and respect its values on some level. I mean, it's increasingly getting worse, and it's been better at other times in the past, but we live in a much better condition than what they did at this time. And Paul knew that when he went out to preach this was a message that was an offense. This was going to be a scandal. This was something that the world did not like and was not wanting to receive, and he knew that by experience also. But he said he still wanted to reach out to all men, even if it would just save some. He said, "And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you." That was it. His only end. All the means he used were to one end and one end only: the glory of God in Christ through the preached gospel. That was his paycheck. That was his reward. That's what he wanted. And it's the only thing, the only motivation, the only end that will carry you through this life as a preaching Christian. If you do it for money, you will lose your motivation. Because eventually, though, either the money will run out or you'll get enough of it that you're satisfied. The other problem is that if you try to do it for the praise of men, again, the same thing will happen. Either the praises will run out or you'll be satisfied with the ones that sit in your echo chamber. But if you're going to preach God's gospel and preach it unchangingly, that can be your only motivation, is to see God glorified in his gospel. He said, "Know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize? So run, that ye may obtain. And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air, but I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway." And Paul ends this chapter by using some athletic comparisons. His first one is about a runner. And of course, everybody here can understand that. When you run a race, contrary to the modern school of thought, it's not just about participation. It's to win. I mean, if we're going to run, then we're going to try to win that race. Paul says this is the same motivation we ought to have. A healthy competition. That when your brothers are running harder, you try to run right with them. He says try to run as one trying to seize that prize and that crown. But do it cleanly. We was watching some of the Olympics and they had the speed skating, and if you got too close to somebody in that and you pushed them and they fell down, they'd call a foul and you'd lose the race. They'd just throw you out of it. So, this is a healthy competition. A clean race is what you ought to be running. He also says here that every man that striveth for the mastery. If you're trying to perfect something, if you're trying to work on a skill, you have to be temperate. You have to be controlled, because there's going to be times where your temper is going to get out of hand. It's going to be frustrating, and you're not going to have exactly what you need sometimes. But you have to be temperate. You have to be self-controlled. He says these are the things that he works on. He does it with a sincere and clean competitive motive is what he's got. A drive. He's got a serious drive to reach the goal. He's also being temperate, controlling himself. Not running wild and going crazy, but staying in that straight and narrow path as he pursues that goal. He says, the world will strive after their crafts. They will strive after their skills and their events for corruptible crowns. There's those wrong motives again. Praise of men, money, power, fame. If you strive after these corruptible crowns, that's exactly what they'll do. Even when you achieve them, they'll sit on your head and they'll rot. But he says our end goal in glorifying God through the gospel is greater than that, because you're achieving an incorruptible crown. A crown that in eternity is made of solid gold and will continue to shine on and on. He said, I therefore so run. not as uncertainly. And then he says, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air. Think of this as in a boxing term. He's saying that he doesn't just shadow box. And one of the things I think he's warning about here, the best way I understand this, is that he's saying, don't set up straw men, if y'all understand what I mean by that. Like if you're going to go out and confront this world's philosophies, if you're going to confront this world's ideals, if you're going to confront the wrong morals of this world, don't practice on shadow arguments. I mean, understand who your enemy is. Learn who they are, how they think, what they do, but you don't subscribe to their ideas. You only learn about them in such a way that you could combat those wrong ideals with the truth of God. Chiefly, though, you need to be skilled in knowing how to use your own gloves, though. That's your sword here. You need to know how to use this weapon before you go out and fight. But once you've got in this path he's talking about here, where you're striving after the mastery, when you're trying to grow and mature as a Christian and be a better preacher, be a better witness, be a better Sunday school teacher, whatever craft it is that you've got to work on, learn how to use your own equipment well. And then use it. Put the glove on skin, so to speak. It does no good. If a man could be the greatest boxer in the world, but if all he does is dance around the ring by himself, box in the air, he won't achieve any kind of glory. He won't achieve any kind of profit. And nobody cares how bad he can beat up the air. It only matters when the gloves connect with skin. And the truth is, they already mentioned it one time in verse 7, who goeth to warfare at any time at his own charge. Paul's used this terminology over and over again. You are in a war. It's a spiritual war. It's an intellectual war. You're in a war of ideals and morals as the kingdom of darkness tries to corrupt minds and hearts and turn them from God. But then the last thing he says, he gives the warning. As you go after this goal, he said you're going to have to watch out for that one enemy that you can't shake. That enemy that clings to you like a bag of dead bones, this flesh. And he says you keep it under subjection. Discipline it. Keep it under the control of Christ. Keep it under the control of the Spirit. Rule over your vessel. Don't let it rule you. He said, because there's the problem is when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. What he's meaning there is your reputation, your witness, the power that comes, like when he said earlier, when he wanted to glorify God's gospel. If Paul was saying that he was a Christian, that he had died to sin, that he was risen with Christ, that he was changed and living and walking a new life, if he said those things and he preached those things hard and he walked right out that door and lived like the world, it all fell away. All the glory went out of it. And he's saying, don't let that happen. There's other enemies out here I think you need to watch out for, but that one right there is the one that'll be with you always. It never goes away, and you got to watch for it.